Hello everyone, and welcome to the screencast for Chapter 13 on plant evolution and classification. I have a blank screen here because I'd like you to think about something for a second. Think about what location in the United States do we guard probably better than any other location? Is it where we keep our money? Is it where we keep our jewelry? What do we guard? Where we keep our oil? Well, believe it or not, it's this place. It's Fort Collins, Colorado, and it's where we preserve our seeds. Now that might be curious to you, and why would we spend so much money guarding our seeds? That's because most of the plants we grow for our food are a monoculture. That means the genetics of those seeds is exactly the same, so that if there were a virus to evolve or a bacteria to evolve that couldn't combat it, we might lose, like our corn plants, all of them, because they're so similar and would be prone to that disease. Well, here we keep genetic diversity in Fort Collins, so if that does happen, we have other seeds to move it forward. I just wanted to show you that. In this chapter, we're going to give you an introduction to the plant kingdom and the 4 types of modern plants. And here we're going to identify the traits of plants, explain the importance of plants, give you an overview of the plant cycle. Very important is going to be the major events in plant evolution. Plants started out in the ocean, but eventually they made it on land. And we'll take a look at that. So plants are multicellular eukaryotes, and the cell walls are made of cellulose. Cellulose helps them stand up. Plants also have chloroplasts. We saw that earlier in our course, and they have specialized reproductive organs. We'll talk more about that in a second. How do plants obtain food? Almost all plants obtain their food by using photosynthesis. Only 1% of the 300,000 species of plants have lost the ability to photosynthesize. And what they do is they grab it either from heat or they grab it from other plants. So this Venus flytrap grabs nutrients from the insects that it catches. Plants are super important to us and the world, and the reason for that are many. One is that they supply food. Plants also maintain our atmosphere. They recycle matter in biogeochemical cycles, and they provide many products for use: firewood, timber, medicines, dyes, pesticides, oils, and rubber. Plants also create habitats for many different organisms. So plants are super, super important. A lot of people don't know that plants have an alternation of generations as far as their life cycle is concerned. So for example, plants alternate between haploid and diploid generations. So a haploid generation means the same genetic material. Diploid, the possibility of mixing, so sexual reproduction. So alternation of generations allow for both asexual, and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction with spores produces haploid individuals, which are called gametophytes, and sexual reproduction with gametes and fertilization produces diploid individual called sporophytes. So if you take a look at this diagram, this is the upper half. The light blue here is how the haploid number is produced. This is asexual reproduction, and sexual reproduction is down here, where the diploid number of chromosomes is produced. One thing that's real important in this chapter is to be able to be familiar with the evolution of plants. And this diagram will probably be on the quiz. And if you look at it, it says from a simple green algae ancestor that lived in water. So if we go back here, we go back in time. All plants lived in the ocean, but as they evolved onto land, they first evolved as non-vascular small plants like mosses, liverworts, hornworts. Most of you guys are not familiar with liverworts or hornworts. We'll see pictures in a second, but mosses you are familiar with. So most initial land plants were about the size of a moss, but then eventually, as vascular plants evolved. Non-vascular means they don't have any tubes within the plant to carry up water and nutrients from the ground. Vascular plants do. And so vascular plants have what are called xylem and phloem. We'll see that a little bit later. And at first, these vascular plants were non-seed. They didn't have seeds. But then we had seeds in conifers and then flowering plants. Flowering plants are by far the most successful plants on land. And what does that mean? That means there are more species of them than any other. So read about life on land, how plants evolved. These are in this picture right here, these are liverworts, but make sure you read about how plants colonize the land. We think that was about 700 million years ago. So think of that. The Earth at that point was about 3.8 billion years old, and about 700 million years ago, the first land plants. The oldest fossils we have were back to about 470 million years ago, so just before the Cambrian explosion. Vascular plants evolve. Your book will talk about these. And vascular plants have what's referred to as a plumbing system, where they can carry minerals and water from the soil to the leaves for photosynthesis. And these early adaptation that vascular plants have were things like lignin, leaves, roots, and generated spores with 2 sets of chromosomes. You probably don't know what lignin is, so make sure you read and understand that. We know what leaves and roots are. Seed plants emerged. Seeds were a huge adaptation for plants to be successful on land. Make sure you read and understand that. There are 2 types of seed plants that evolved. The first are called gymnosperms. So if you're familiar with pine cones, the term gymno is a Greek term coming from the word gymnasium, where the Greeks would exercise and bathe naked, and this refers to the naked seed in a gymnosperm. So pine cones have a seed in them, but it's not surrounded by anything. Angiosperm, plants which evolved later, are surrounded by a vessel. Angio comes from the Greek word meaning vessel. So think of the difference between a pine cone and an apple. An apple has the seeds inside, but it's surrounded by that vessel that we call the fruit, but there's lots of other types. So make sure you read about the evolution of seed plants. This is Marcus Eichhorn. Marcus works in England. He's a botanist. And in this one, he talks about some of the topics we just talked about on the evolution of plants. So please watch this. He does a really nice job. Also, watch this. Most people don't understand that plants, even though they don't move, have sophisticated ways to defend themselves. So make sure you watch this TED Ed, which talks about how plants defend. So there are 4 modern plant types. The first, which is non-vascular, are called bryophytes. These tend to be pretty small. They can't grow very large. But then we have vascular plants. So these have xylem and phloem that allow water and nutrients to come up from the soil, get it out to the leaves where photosynthesis is taking place. We have seed plants called spermatophytes, and we have flowering plants, which are called angiosperms. Make sure you know the difference. And this whole section, 13.2, is about the 4 types of modern plants. Non-vascular plants, as we said, are called bryophytes. And despite the dominance of vascular today, there are more than 17,000 bryophytes that still survive. And these include liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. As we mentioned before, you're probably familiar with mosses. Here are, in your textbook, they talk about non-vascular plants, and they tend to be small, and just read about the characteristics of those. The diversity, they talk about liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. We have another picture here. That's liverwort on the left, hornwort in the middle, and mosses over here. Those are all non-vascular plants. They tend to be small, green, they photosynthesize. Vascular plants, which are known as tracheophytes, which means tube plants. The earliest vascular plants quickly came to dominate terrestrial ecosystem. That means dominate the land. Why were they so successful? It was mainly because of their tube-like vascular tissues. So they could go into the ground and pull water up, whereas a lot of the bryophytes couldn't. And this is what vascular, xylem and phloem, are the 2 types of vascular tissue. Make sure you read about them and understand them. And these diagrams kind of explain that over here. The xylem on the left, which is carrying nutrients up, that's those red arrows, and the blue arrows in the phloem are carrying materials down. The evolution of vascular plants took place because they evolved what's called vascular tissues. They also evolved lignin, and they evolved leaves to collect sunlight to make them much more efficient photosynthesizers. So make sure you read about the evolution of vascular plants. Remember that Marcus Eichhorn video will also help you with it. Seed plants, which are called spermatophytes, the evolution of seeds by vascular plants was a very big deal, your textbook says, and it talks about why that's important. And seeds consist of 3 basic parts: the embryo, the seed coat, and the stored food. So make sure you're familiar with that. Here's a diagram. A typical plant seed is like this avocado. The seed coat is on the outside right here. The embryo right in here. Dandelions have many parachutes and maples have wings, and these are different ways that seeds can disperse. Seeds need to get away from their parent plant and find new areas to explore. Disbursement is one. Make sure you know the difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms. We talked a little bit about that. The gymnosperm means naked seed. There's no vessel around it. Think pine cones. And the angiosperm does have a vessel around it. There's the seed, and that vessel in a lot of cases is a fruit. So read about the evolution of seed plants. Really, really interesting that plants evolve just the way animals have. Flowering plants, which we mentioned were the most successful type of plant, make sure you know the parts of the flower. The stamen, which is the male reproductive part. The pistil is the female part, and there's a stigma and petals, and then the sepals are those leaves around it. Make sure you know the part. We have a diagram right here showing you that. So this right here, the pistil, is the female part of the plant, and the seed will be formed here. When the stamen, the male parts of the flower, release pollen, some of that pollen will go down here, fertilize the seed, fertilize the embryo, the egg, which becomes a seed. And this is a diagram of both the male and the female reproductive structures. When a flowering plant has both male and female, it's called a perfect flower. There are some trees and some plants that are either, they'll have a male flower or a female flower. If you suffer from pollen, you'll be interested in this. I'd like you to watch this short animation on what causes hay fever and what we can do about it and why it happens. And there are two different type of videos that I'd like you to see. The first is Ron Finley, who's the gorilla gardener in South Central LA. It's really an inspiring short talk. And then Steve Ritz is a 6th grade teacher. That's actually not Steve pictured there. That's one of his students. And he talks about how he uses plants to inspire his kids and get them healthy. The South Bronx is one of the poorest districts in our country. So I think it's pretty inspiring what Steve is doing with his students there. So I'd like you to watch that. Okay, so please make sure you read this chapter carefully. This is chapter 13 on plants, and good luck on the quiz.